Thank you for that most generous and kind introduction. I want to return the compliment with a few words also about Ambassador Ronald Lauder. I cannot think of a better leader for the World Jewish Congress than Ambassador Lauder. He is widely respected and widely listened to by heads of state all over the world. He can pick up the phone and talk to presidents, prime ministers, and kings on a moment's notice. I assure you that is the case with President Trump. Ambassador Lauder is a tireless advocate for the Jewish people, and I'm proud to call him a friend. I also want to recognize that there are several of my former fellow United Nations ambassadors here tonight. If you would stand, I would love to see your faces. I am so happy to see all of you again. You became my friends and taught me so much. You made my experience at the UN special, and I am a better person for it, so thank you. It is incredibly humbling to receive this award. Theodor Herzl is a towering figure, not just in modern Jewish history, but in modern world history. Herzl's vision was for a Jewish state, but this vision has much broader implications for all of humanity. We see it today in one catastrophe after another all around the world. In China, the communist government has brutally forced over 1 million Uyghurs into re-education camps for the, quote, crimes of practicing their faith and giving their children ethnic names. In Burma, over 600,000 Rohingya were forced to flee their homes in a wave of grotesque ethnic cleansing at the hands of the Burmese army. In Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, the minority Kurdish population has been systematically discriminated against, attacked, robbed, and murdered for many years. The Uyghurs, the Rohingya, and the Kurds all have one thing in common. They all lack a state of their own that can protect them from the hate mongers that surround them. And we all know the horrible truth. In one of the darkest hours in human history, in the last century, this and worse was the fate of the stateless Jews of Europe. It is not the fate of the Jewish people today because the state of Israel exists. It will never be the fate of the Jewish people again as long as the state of Israel remains strong. That is Herzl's vision, and it has come to life in spectacular fashion. Shortly after the 2016 election, President-elect Trump called me to talk about serving in his administration. We had a meeting at Trump Tower. Long story short, he called me a couple of days later and said he'd like me to serve as the ambassador to the United Nations. We went back and forth on a few things. I said it would have to be a cabinet position. He said, done. I said I would have to be a member of the National Security Council. He said, done. And then the clincher was this. I told the president, you know, I won't be a wallflower or a talking head. I have to be able to say what I think. And without any hesitation, President Trump said, Nikki, that's exactly why I want you to do this. The president was true to his word from the beginning of my service to the very end. When I arrived at the United Nations, I was new to international diplomacy. To prepare for the job, I studied a lot. It is important to know as much as possible about each country's needs and views. But I learned that isn't the most important part of the job. The most important thing is to not be afraid to rely on your core values, even when they go against outdated customs. At the UN, some of those customs have gone unquestioned for years. One of those core values is standing up for your friends. So on my first day on the job, I chose to reach out to ambassadors from 4 other countries. I called the British and French ambassadors because they are our closest allies on the Security Council. I called on the ambassador from Ukraine, who I'm pleased to say is with us tonight. I wanted to reassure him that America would not waver in standing up for his country against Russian aggression. And my fourth call on that first day was to Danny Danon, the Israeli ambassador. Just about 1 month before I arrived, in the closing days of the Obama administration, the United States allowed UN Security Council Resolution 2334 to pass. This was the resolution that condemned all Israeli activity in all of the territory won in the defensive war of 1967, including in the Jewish quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem. It was shameful that America let that happen. We refused to stand up for our friend when it was singled out in a horrible way. I assured the Israeli ambassador that as long as I was there, it would not happen again. And I'm proud to say, Danny, it didn't. Another core value I took with me into the job was that I have no patience for bullies. When I grew up, we were the only Indian family in a small southern town in South Carolina. We weren't white enough to be white. We weren't black enough to be black. My parents were immigrants. My father wore a turban. He still does to this day. My mother wore a sari. The people in our town didn't know who we were, what we were, or why we were there. So there were many times when I was bullied growing up. When I became governor, every month I went to schools throughout our state talking about bullying. For me, it was just something so fundamental. You don't pick on someone just because they look different from you, or because they think differently, or just because you can. This idea has always been with me since I was a child, but I didn't think it would come into play at the United Nations. It turns out it's a common practice at the UN. In the real world, Israel is a strong country with a vibrant economy and a first-class military. On the battlefield, Israel does not get bullied. But the UN is a different story. At the UN and throughout the UN agencies, Israel has been bullied for decades. Bullied because the countries that don't like Israel were used to getting away with it, and always had. Well, just like when I was that 5-year-old girl in Bamberg, South Carolina, that just didn't sit well with me. Every month at the Security Council, there's a session devoted to the Middle East. I came to refer to it as the monthly Israel bashing session. This has gone on for decades. I was shocked at what I witnessed. I came out of that first session and publicly said, if we want to talk about security in the Middle East, we should talk about Iran, or Syria, or Hezbollah, or Hamas, or ISIS, or the famine in Yemen. There are about 10 major problems facing the Middle East, and Israel doesn't have anything to do with any one of them. Just about every month after that, I spoke about something other than Israel. I can't say that we've solved the problem, but I can say that several other countries followed our lead. What used to be a monthly Israel bashing session now at least has a little more balance. Then there was the American decision to move our embassy to Jerusalem. That caused quite a stir at the United Nations. In the Security Council, almost exactly 1 year after America abstained on Resolution 2334, I proudly cast my first American veto. When I was governor, I used my veto power dozens of times. At the UN, I never did until the Jerusalem vote. It was one of the greatest honors of my tenure. The next week, the Jerusalem issue was brought before the entire UN General Assembly. We lost that vote, but to many people's surprise, 65 countries refused to go against us. In the long history of the UN's bias against Israel, 65 votes on our side was jaw-dropping. And we would not forget that vote. Like I said many times at the UN, we were taking names. I told President Trump at the time, and I still believe it today, we have to draw a closer connection between U.S. foreign aid and how countries vote at the UN. I know the President agrees with that. I hope it happens as soon as possible. Some people accused us of favoritism towards Israel. First of all, there's nothing wrong with showing favoritism toward an ally. That's what being an ally is all about. But what we did was really not about favoritism. In all that we did at the UN, our approach to Israel was tied together by one major idea. The idea is the simple concept that Israel must be treated like any other normal country. We demand that Israel not be treated like some sort of temporary provisional entity. It cannot be the case that only one country in the world doesn't get to choose its capital city. It cannot be the case that the UN Human Rights Council has a standing agenda item for only one country. It cannot be the case that only one set of refugees throughout the world is counted in a way that causes the number to grow forever. It cannot be the case that an organization with 193 countries, the United Nations spends half of its time attacking just one country. We should never tolerate that. And that demand is actually a demand for peace. The UN's bias against Israel has long undermined peace by encouraging an illusion that Israel will just go away. Israel is not going away. When the world recognizes that, then peace becomes possible. It becomes possible because all sides will be dealing with realities, not fantasies. And when we deal with realities, then reasonable negotiated compromises can prevail over absolutist demands. The World Jewish Congress has an incredibly important job. Your continued support for Israel on the world stage is critical. Thankfully, Israel today is a thriving and strong country. It is Jewish communities around the world that are having more troubles. As you are painfully aware, the ancient hatred of anti-Semitism is once again on the rise. Your focus on fighting it is absolutely vital. It is baffling to me that in some quarters, anti-Semitism is not treated with the same disdain as racism or other forms of hate. It is exactly the same. It must never be tolerated. It must never be excused. It must never be rationalized. Whether it comes from Iran's supreme leader, or the leader of Britain's Labour Party, or a congresswoman from Minnesota, or white supremacists on the internet, or from someone we come across in our daily lives, it must be called out for the dangerous bigotry that it is. Tragedy. But I also saw how good people of all races and faiths can come together in love and grace and overcome the hatred. That's what we all must continue to do together. That's what we will do together. Thank you so very much, and God bless you all. Thank you.